There is a tomb in the Egyptian desert, south of Cairo, near the ancient necropolis of Saqqara, where the walls are covered in hieroglyphs that tell the story of a king. The inscriptions describe a boy who became pharaoh at the age of 6. They describe his empire, a kingdom that stretched from the cataracts of the Nile to the turquoise mines of the Sinai, from the cedar trade routes of Byblos to the gold caravans of Nubia. They describe a reign that lasted, according to the ancient king lists, for 94 years. 94 years. That is not a misprint. That is not a scribal error, though some scholars have argued it might be. If the ancient records are correct, this one man sat on the throne of Egypt for nearly a century. He outlived his children. He outlived his grandchildren. He outlived the officials who served him, and the officials who replaced those officials, and the officials who replaced them. He watched the seasons turn more than 90 times from the palace windows at Memphis, and when he finally died, an old man in a kingdom that had known no other ruler for the span of living memory, the civilization he had governed simply fell apart. His name was Pepi II, 6th king of Egypt's 6th dynasty, last significant ruler of what we now call the Old Kingdom. And his story is one of the strangest and most unsettling in all of human history. Not because of what he built, though he built a great deal. Not because of what he conquered, though his armies reached deep into Nubia and his trade expeditions sailed as far as the land of Punt. His story is unsettling because of what happened after him. Within a generation of his death, the centralized Egyptian state, the oldest and most powerful government structure the world had ever known, collapsed. The provincial governors stopped obeying the capital. The royal court fractured. The Nile floods, which had sustained Egyptian agriculture for over 1,000 years, began to fail. Famine spread through the valley. Tomb inscriptions from the decades after Pepi's death describe scenes that would have been unthinkable during the height of the Old Kingdom. Parents eating their own children, officials begging for food, temples standing empty, a civilization that had built the Great Pyramids of Giza, monuments so massive that they would remain the tallest structures on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, was reduced to starvation and civil war within a single human lifetime after this one pharaoh's death. How does that happen? How does the longest reign in recorded history end not with triumph, but with total disintegration? How does a kingdom survive for 8 centuries, produce some of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in human existence, govern millions of people along a narrow river valley, with a bureaucracy so efficient it could mobilize tens of thousands of laborers for a single construction project, and then simply cease to function? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that Egyptologists have debated for more than a century, and the answers they have found are not comforting, because the forces that destroyed the Old Kingdom of Egypt, institutional decay, environmental crisis, the concentration of power in a single figure for too long, the slow erosion of public trust, are not ancient forces. They are forces that operate in every civilization, in every era, including this one. That is the question at the center of this story, and the answer when it comes will not be simple. It involves climate, power, ambition, aging, institutional decay, and a drought that lasted for decades. It involves the slow erosion of authority, not from invasion, not from revolution, but from something quieter and far more dangerous, the steady loss of belief in the system itself. And it begins with a letter written by a child king to an explorer in the southern deserts, a letter so full of excitement and wonder that it was carved into the wall of the explorer's tomb so that it would be remembered forever. That letter is the first glimpse we have of Pepi II as a human being, a 6-year-old boy on the throne of the most powerful nation on earth, writing to a man who had captured a dancing dwarf in the land beyond the cataracts, and begging him to bring it to the palace alive. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand how a child became a god king, how a god king became an old man, how an old man's grip on power outlasted the institutions that made that power meaningful, and how the longest reign in history became a prologue to catastrophe. You are going to understand why civilizations do not simply fall, they exhaust themselves. And you are going to see, in the story of Pepi II, a pattern so familiar it should make us uncomfortable. A pattern that whispers a warning across 4,000 years of silence. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. To understand Pepi II, you first have to understand the world he inherited, a world so ancient, so layered with centuries of accumulated power, that even by the standards of antiquity, it was old. When Pepi ascended the throne around 2278 BC, according to current scholarly estimates, Egypt had already been a unified kingdom for roughly 700 years. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, the largest and most famous of all the pyramids, had been standing for nearly 3 centuries by the time the boy king took his seat. Think about what that means. When Pepi looked north toward Giza, he saw monuments that were as old to him as the cathedrals of medieval Europe are to us. The Old Kingdom of Egypt was not a young civilization finding its footing. It was a mature, deeply entrenched, almost impossibly stable political system, one that had survived dynastic transitions, regional famines, border conflicts, and the ordinary turnover of human generations for longer than most civilizations exist in total. The Old Kingdom, stretching across the 3rd through 6th dynasties, represented what many Egyptologists consider the first golden age of pharaonic civilization. This was the age of the pyramid builders, the age when Egyptian kings commanded resources on a scale that would not be matched anywhere else on Earth for millennia. The Step Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, designed by the legendary architect Imhotep around 2670 BC, was the first monumental stone structure in human history. Before Djoser, human beings built with mud brick, with wood, with reeds. The tallest structures on the planet were modest mud brick platforms. After Djoser, they built with eternity in mind. Imhotep's innovation was not merely architectural, it was conceptual. He looked at the traditional mastaba tomb, a low, flat-topped rectangle of mud brick, and stacked 6 increasingly smaller mastabas on top of each other, creating a stepped tower of dressed limestone that rose 62 meters into the desert sky. Nothing like it had ever been built, nothing like it had ever been imagined, and the civilization that produced it would spend the next 4 centuries trying to surpass it. They succeeded. Within a century of Djoser's death, the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, transformed the stepped pyramid into the true pyramid and built the monuments at Giza that remain among the most recognizable structures on Earth. Khufu's Great Pyramid, completed around 2560 BC, originally stood 146 meters tall, nearly the height of a modern 50-story building, and was composed of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. Some of the internal granite beams weigh as much as 80 tons. The precision of its construction is extraordinary. The base is level to within just 2.1 centimeters across a distance of 230 meters. The sides are aligned to true north, with an accuracy of less than 1/12 of a degree. These are not rough approximations. These are measurements that modern engineers, working with laser-guided equipment, would consider excellent, and they were achieved more than 4,500 years ago by workers using copper tools, wooden sledges, and an organizational system so efficient that it remains the subject of intense scholarly debate. At its peak, the Old Kingdom governed a population estimated at roughly 1.5 million people, stretched along a narrow strip of fertile land beside the Nile, rarely more than 20 kilometers wide, for a distance of over 1,000 kilometers from the delta in the north to the first cataract at Aswan in the south. This was a civilization shaped entirely by a single river. The Nile's annual flood deposited a layer of rich black silt across the valley floor each summer, and this silt was the foundation of everything: agriculture, taxation, population growth, and ultimately royal power. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, the Black Land, a name that referred not to the people but to the soil, the dark fertile mud that the Nile brought each year from the highlands of Central Africa. Beyond the reach of the flood lay Deshret, the Red Land, the barren desert that surrounded the valley on both sides. The boundary between the two was knife-sharp. You could stand with one foot on irrigated farmland and the other on sterile sand. This stark division shaped every aspect of Egyptian life. It reinforced a worldview built on dualities: order and chaos, life and death, the fertile valley and the hostile desert. And it made the Nile flood not just an agricultural event, but a theological one. The pharaoh did not merely rule Egypt. In the theology of the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh was the reason the Nile flooded. He was the intermediary between the human world and the divine. He performed the rituals that ensured cosmic order, a concept the Egyptians called Mat, and in return, the people gave him their labor, their grain, and their obedience. This was not a metaphor. This was the operating system of an entire civilization, and for centuries it worked. The bureaucracy that supported this system was staggering in its complexity. The Old Kingdom developed one of the earliest professional civil services in history. Provincial administrators called nomarchs governed the 42 nomes, the administrative districts, of Upper and Lower Egypt. A vizier served as the pharaoh's chief minister, overseeing taxation, justice, construction, and the management of royal estates. Below the vizier sat an elaborate hierarchy of treasurers, overseers of works, seal-bearers, and directors of granaries, each responsible for a specific domain of government activity. Scribes, perhaps the most important class in the entire system, recorded everything: the height of the Nile flood each year, the grain yields from each district, the labor obligations of each village, the inventories of royal storehouses. An Old Kingdom scribe named Tashepses, whose tomb was discovered at Abusir in the 19th century, held titles that reveal the astonishing specificity of the bureaucracy: overseer of all the works of the king, director of the palace, keeper of the diadem, master of the secrets of every royal command. Each title represented a real function, a real responsibility. These were not empty honors, they were the operating manual of a state. These records were not luxuries, they were the nervous system of the state. Without them, the pyramids could not have been built, because the pyramids were not built by slaves, as popular myth once claimed, but by organized labor forces drawn from the farming population during the flood season, when agricultural work was impossible. The discovery of the workers' village at Giza in 1990 by the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass and the American archaeologist Mark Lehner transformed our understanding of pyramid construction. The village contained bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread per day, breweries, fish processing facilities, copper workshops, and dormitories organized by work crew. The workers were fed, housed, and rotated in shifts. Analysis of animal bones from the site revealed that the laborers ate beef, a luxury food in ancient Egypt, suggesting that the state provided them with a standard of living higher than what they would have enjoyed at home. The logistics required to feed, shelter, and coordinate tens of thousands of laborers working on a single construction site for decades, cutting limestone blocks, transporting them across the desert on ramps and sledges, raising them into precise geometric alignment, demanded a level of administrative sophistication that modern project managers study with genuine admiration. Mark Lehner, who spent decades mapping the Giza Plateau and reconstructing the logistics of pyramid construction, described the process in terms that make the scale unmistakable. He estimated that the Great Pyramid required approximately 20,000 workers at peak activity, supported by a supply chain that drew resources from across the entire kingdom. Granite from Aswan, over 900 kilometers to the south, limestone from the Tura quarries on the east bank of the Nile, copper from the Sinai, food from the agricultural districts of the Delta. This was not a labor of brute force. It was a labor of planning, coordination, and institutional memory. The accumulated knowledge of generations of builders, engineers, and administrators transmitted through a scribal tradition that was already centuries old when the Great Pyramid was begun. And the pyramids were only the most visible expression of this capacity. The Old Kingdom produced achievements in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and literature that would influence Egyptian civilization for millennia. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, though copied in a later period, is believed to contain medical knowledge dating back to the Old Kingdom. A systematic treatment for surgical cases organized from head to foot, describing injuries, diagnoses, and recommended treatments with a clinical precision that would not be matched in Europe for 3,000 years. Old Kingdom astronomers developed a calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30 days each, with 5 additional days at the end of the year. A system so practical that it remained in use, with minor modifications, until the Roman era. The mathematical knowledge required to design and build the pyramids, the calculation of volumes, angles, slopes, and load-bearing capacities was codified in problem sets that scribes studied and copied for centuries. This was not a society of primitive builders heaving stones. This was a society of engineers, physicians, astronomers, and bureaucrats. The reach of this civilization extended far beyond the Nile Valley. Old Kingdom Egypt maintained trade relationships with Byblos on the Lebanese coast, with the copper mines of the Sinai, with the mysterious land of Punt, probably located on the Horn of Africa, and with the peoples of Nubia to the south. Egyptian objects from this period have been found as far away as Crete and the Aegean Islands. A fragment of an Egyptian stone vessel was discovered at Ebla in modern Syria, a city that maintained diplomatic contacts with the pharaonic court. The Old Kingdom was not an isolated kingdom on the edge of the desert. It was the center of a web of exchange that connected northeastern Africa to the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Its collapse would not merely end a dynasty. It would disrupt a network of relationships that had taken centuries to build. When the Old Kingdom fell, it was not one kingdom that went silent. It was an entire system of exchange, communication, diplomatic correspondence, and mutual dependence that fractured, leaving gaps in the archaeological record across the entire eastern Mediterranean that would not be filled for generations. This was the world Pepi II inherited, a world of monumental ambition, divine authority, and bureaucratic precision. But it was also a world that had already begun to change in ways that no one at the time fully understood. The seeds of the Old Kingdom's destruction were not planted by Pepi. They were planted by his predecessors, by the very system that had made Egypt great. And to see them clearly, you have to look at the century before Pepi's birth. The 5th dynasty, which preceded Pepi's 6th dynasty, had introduced a practice that would prove fatal over time: the granting of tax exemptions to temples and to favoured provincial officials. These decrees, known to Egyptologists as royal immunity decrees, exempted specific estates or institutions from the obligations that funded the central government. The earliest known example comes from the reign of Neferikare, the 3rd king of the 5th dynasty, who exempted the temple of Abydos from certain labour obligations. On the surface, this seemed harmless, even generous. A pharaoh would issue a decree exempting a particular temple or estate from paying taxes to the crown. The recipients were grateful. The local priests and officials gained wealth and influence, and the pharaoh gained their loyalty, at least in the short term. But each exemption meant less revenue flowing to the central government, and as the decades passed, the exemptions accumulated, each one setting a precedent that made the next one harder to refuse. By the time of the 6th dynasty, we have archaeological evidence of multiple such decrees, carved on stone slabs and erected at the entrances to temple complexes, at Abydos, at Koptos, at Dashur, each one chipping away at the fiscal foundation of the state. Temples grew richer, provincial nomarchs grew more powerful, the royal treasury grew thinner. It was a slow bleed, almost invisible in any single generation, but over the course of a century, it fundamentally shifted the balance of power in Egypt. The pharaohs of the 5th and 6th dynasties were, in effect, giving away their own government, one decree at a time. By the time Pepi II came to the throne, the provincial governors of Upper Egypt had already begun to act with increasing independence. They built their own tombs, not at the royal necropolis near the capital, but in their own districts, a symbolic statement that their loyalty was to their region first and to the pharaoh second. They married into each other's families, creating networks of alliance that bypassed the royal court entirely. They maintained their own militias. They collected their own taxes and made their own decisions about how those taxes were spent. The centralized state that had built the Great Pyramids was slowly, almost imperceptibly, hollowing out from within. But this hollowing was invisible to those who lived inside it. The monuments still stood, the rituals still proceeded, the Nile still flooded each summer, the scribes still wrote their reports, and the priests still chanted their hymns. and in Memphis, the great capital city near the apex of the delta, a city whose population may have reached 30,000 people, a city whose very name gave rise to the word Egypt, through the Greek rendering of one of its temple names. The court of the pharaohs still functioned with all the ceremony and grandeur of centuries past. It was into this court, magnificent on the surface, quietly weakening beneath, that a 6-year-old boy named Neferkar, whom history would remember as Pepi II, was placed upon the Horus throne. The circumstances of his accession are themselves a story of fragility. His father, Pepi I, had ruled for decades, perhaps as many as 50 years, though the exact figure is debated. Pepi I was a capable ruler who had conducted military campaigns into Nubia and the Sinai, maintained Egypt's trade networks, and managed the increasingly assertive nomarchs with a combination of patronage and strategic marriage. He married at least 2 women from the powerful family of the nomarch of Abydos, a family so influential that modern scholars refer to it as the Aberdeen family, and its members appear in inscriptions across multiple sites in Upper Egypt. These marriages were political acts, attempts to bind the most powerful provincial families to the crown through personal loyalty and blood relation. When Pepi I died, the throne passed briefly to his son Merenre, Pepi II's older half-brother. But Merenre's reign was short, perhaps as few as 5 years, perhaps as many as 11. The sources disagree. What they agree on is that Merenre died young, and the crown passed to a child. Pepi II's mother, Ankhesenpepi II, served as regent during his early years, one of the few women in Old Kingdom history to wield real political power. A remarkable statue, now in the Brooklyn Museum in New York, depicts her seated on a throne with the young Pepi on her lap, a smaller figure, but wearing the royal Nemes headdress and holding the crook and flail of kingship. The statue is both tender and political, a mother holding her child, and a regent displaying her authority. The sculptural tradition of Egypt had no precedent for this image. Previous depictions of queens showed them standing beside their husbands or seated at smaller scale, subordinate to the male pharaoh. This statue places a woman at the center, holding the king, both literally and figuratively. It tells us that the power dynamics at the beginning of the 6th dynasty's final chapter were unusual, perhaps unprecedented, and that the people who crafted this image wanted everyone who saw it to understand that. Her brother, a man named Jawo, served as vizier, the most powerful administrative office in Egypt after the pharaoh himself. Jao's tomb inscriptions reveal a man of considerable ambition and administrative skill, responsible for overseeing the entire machinery of government. While his nephew grew into manhood, the concentration of power in a single family, the queen mother as regent, her brother as vizier, was a double-edged arrangement. It provided stability during the vulnerable years of a child king's minority, but it also meant that the royal government was effectively controlled by a provincial family from Upper Egypt, the family of the nomarchs of Abydos, rather than by the traditional court elite at Memphis. This shift in the social origin of power, from the capital to the provinces, would prove to be a harbinger of the larger transformation that Pepi's reign would witness. Together, they governed Egypt in the boy king's name, maintaining the diplomatic and military posture of the state while the child grew into his role. And it is from these earliest years, when Pepi was still a boy, still learning the rituals and responsibilities of kingship, that we have one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. In the early 20th century, archaeologists working at the tomb of a man named Harkhuf in the cliffs near Aswan discovered an inscription that made them stop and reread it several times. Harkhuf was a nobleman and explorer who had conducted 4 expeditions into the lands south of Egypt, deep into Nubia and possibly beyond, into the regions the Egyptians called Yam. On his 4th expedition, Harkhuf had captured something extraordinary, a dwarf who could dance. The Egyptians called such people Deng, and they were considered great treasures, entertainers of the highest order, associated with the rituals of the gods. Harkhuf sent word ahead to the palace that he was bringing the dwarf back to Memphis, and the young pharaoh, Pepi II, perhaps 8 or 9 years old at the time, wrote back a letter of such unbridled excitement that Harkhuf considered it the greatest honor of his life and had it carved onto the facade of his tomb in full. The letter reads, in part, "Come north to the residence at once. Hurry and bring with you this dwarf which you have brought from the land of the horizon dwellers, alive, sound, and well, for the dances of the god, to gladden the heart, to delight the heart of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Neferkar, who lives forever. When he goes down with you into the ship, appoint trustworthy people who shall be beside him on each side of the vessel. Take care lest he fall into the water. When he sleeps at night, appoint trustworthy people who shall sleep beside him in his tent. Inspect 10 times a night. My Majesty desires to see this dwarf more than the gifts of the mainland and of Punt." That last line is extraordinary. The boy king, the divine ruler of the most powerful nation on earth, is telling his explorer that he wants the dancing dwarf more than the gold and incense of Sinai and Punt. It is the voice of a child, an excited, eager, utterly human child, giving very specific instructions about how to keep his new treasure safe on the long journey down the Nile. Do not let him fall in the water. Check on him 10 times a night. This letter, carved into stone more than 4,000 years ago, is one of the most vivid and personal documents from the ancient world. It is also, in a way, a farewell to innocence, because the child who wrote it would become something very different over the decades that followed. The boy who could barely contain his excitement about a dancing dwarf would rule Egypt for so long that by the end, the kingdom itself could barely contain its own disintegration. The Egyptologist Miriam Lichtheim, who translated many of the key texts from this period, noted that Pepi's letter to Harkhuf represents something rare in ancient Egyptian literature, a moment of unguarded humanity from a king whose public inscriptions would otherwise present only the mask of divine authority. It is a glimpse behind the formality, a reminder that the pharaohs, for all their monumental self-presentation, were human beings living in specific moments with specific desires and fears, and this particular human being was about to live longer than any ruler in recorded history. The numbers are striking, and they bear repeating. If the ancient king lists are accurate, and the 3rd century BC Egyptian historian Manetho recorded a reign of 94 years, then Pepi II ruled from approximately 2278 to 2184 BC. The Turin King List, a papyrus from the New Kingdom that preserves a list of Egypt's rulers and their reign lengths, gives Pepi a reign of over 90 years, though the exact number on the damaged papyrus is difficult to read. Some modern scholars, notably the German Egyptologist Jürgen von Beckerath, have accepted Manetho's figure of 94 years. Others, including the French scholar Nicolas Grimal, have argued that the true reign may have been closer to 64 years, suggesting a scribal confusion in the later transmission of the hieratic numerals. Even 64 years, however, would make Pepi's reign one of the longest in all of human history. The debate matters, but both figures tell the same essential story. This was a king who ruled for an extraordinarily long time, from childhood into extreme old age, and the consequences of that longevity were devastating. To grasp the scale of what that longevity meant, consider a comparison. Queen Victoria of Great Britain ruled for 63 years, and during that time, the British Empire transformed so completely that the world Victoria left at her death in 1901 was unrecognisable from the world she had inherited in 1837. Railroads, telegraphs, industrial cities, colonial wars, democratic reform, all of it happened under one monarch's watch. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, ruled for 72 years and became so synonymous with the French state that his death triggered a political crisis that would eventually lead to revolution. Now imagine a ruler who surpassed both of them. A ruler who sat on the same throne for nearly a century, while the world changed around him in ways he could neither control nor perhaps even perceive. By the end of such a reign, no one alive would remember a time before that ruler. The pharaoh would not just be the head of state, he would be the state. So deeply identified with the institutions of power that separating the man from the office would become impossible. And when the man finally died, the office itself might not survive the shock. That is exactly what happened to Egypt, but the collapse did not come suddenly. It crept. It arrived in the form of gradually weakening institutions, increasingly powerful local elites, a climate that was slowly drying, and a king who grew old while the world changed around him in silence. And to see how it unfolded, we need to look at the decades of Pepi's reign, not as a summary, but as a slow, gathering catastrophe that no one could stop, because no one alive had ever known anything different. And it gets worse, because the Old Kingdom was not merely a government, it was a cosmology. It was a complete system for understanding the relationship between human beings, the natural world, and the divine. The pharaoh was not a king in the way we understand the term. He was the living embodiment of the god Horus. Upon his death, he became Osiris, lord of the afterlife. The entire apparatus of the state, the temples, the priesthoods, the pyramid complexes, the offerings, the rituals, existed to maintain this cosmic order. When the Old Kingdom fell, it was not just a dynasty that ended, it was a way of understanding reality, and the literature that survives from the period immediately after the collapse reveals a society in profound spiritual crisis. A people who had lost not just their government but their confidence that the universe made sense. The reign of Pepi II is not merely long, it is a case study in the slow, corrosive effects of institutional stagnation. What happens when a political system designed for stability encounters a ruler who outlives the system's ability to adapt? And to understand why the collapse was so total, we need to walk through the decades of his reign, not as a chronological list, but as a story of accumulating pressure, a dam holding back water, each year adding a little more, until the structure gives way all at once. The first decades of Pepi's rule were, by all available evidence, successful. His mother and uncle managed the affairs of state with competence. Egypt's foreign expeditions continued. Harkhuf's journeys into Nubia were part of a broader pattern of southern exploration that brought gold, exotic animals, incense, and slaves back to the royal court. Another official, named Pepi II, based at Elephantine, the island fortress at the First Cataract, conducted at least 2 military campaigns into Nubia during the early years of the reign, punishing raiding groups and recovering the body of an earlier Egyptian official who had been killed while building a ship for an expedition to Punt. A third official, Sabni, mounted a dangerous rescue mission into Nubia to retrieve the body of his own father, who had died during a trading expedition in the south. Sabni's autobiographical inscription, carved into his tomb at Aswan, describes the young pharaoh's response when he learned of the elder man's death. Pepi sent embalmers, ritual oils, fine linen, and incense southward to meet Sabni on his return, ensuring that the dead man would receive a proper burial. These were not defensive actions. These were the operations of a confident, outward-looking state, a state that still had the resources, the manpower, and the administrative capacity to project power hundreds of kilometers beyond its borders and to honor its servants even in death. Trade during the early decades of Pepi's reign extended even further than Nubia. Egyptian expeditions reached the legendary land of Punt, most likely located on the coast of modern-day Eritrea or Somalia, to acquire myrrh, frankincense, ebony, and gold. Ships sailed north to the port of Byblos in modern Lebanon to trade for the cedar wood that Egyptian builders prized for construction and shipbuilding. Turquoise was mined from the Sinai Peninsula. Copper was smelted. The quarries at Hatnub, deep in the eastern desert, supplied the alabaster that lined royal sarcophagi and adorned temple walls. The scope of these operations tells us something crucial about the state Pepi governed in his early decades. It was not a kingdom in retreat. It was a kingdom still reaching outward, still confident in its ability to extract resources from distant lands, and to maintain the complex logistics of long-distance trade. The world was still turning, as it always had. The pyramid that Pepi II built for himself at South Saqqara is itself a testament to the ambitions of the early reign. Known today as the Pyramid of Pepi II, it was the last major royal pyramid of the Old Kingdom. And while it is smaller than the Great Pyramids of the 4th dynasty at Giza, it was still a substantial monument, originally standing at roughly 52 meters tall, with a base length of about 78 meters on each side. The core was built of small limestone blocks bonded with clay mortar and encased in fine white limestone from the Tura quarries, a technique that was standard for 6th dynasty pyramids, but that lacked the massive structural integrity of the 4th dynasty monuments. The interior chambers were inscribed with pyramid texts, the oldest corpus of religious literature in the world, a collection of spells, hymns, and incantations intended to guide the king's soul through the afterlife. These texts had first appeared in the Pyramid of Unas, the last king of the 5th dynasty, and they represent one of the most profound achievements of Old Kingdom civilization, a fully articulated theology of death, resurrection, and cosmic order, carved into stone so that it would endure for eternity. The pyramid texts in Pepi's burial chamber are among the most extensive of any royal pyramid, containing over 800 individual utterances. They include spells that identify the dead king with Osiris, spells that describe his ascent to the stars, and spells that invoke the protection of every major deity in the Egyptian pantheon. One passage declares, "The sky thunders, the earthquake quakes before the king, for he is a great power who has power over the powers." Another reads, "He has come to his throne which is upon the 2 ladies, and the king appears as a star." These are not humble words. They are the words of a civilization that believed its king was literally divine, that his death was not an ending, but a transformation, and that the survival of the cosmic order depended on the proper performance of his burial rites. The investment of resources in Pepi's pyramid complex, which included a mortuary temple, a causeway, a valley temple, and several smaller pyramids for his queen, tells us that in the early decades of his reign, the central government still had the wealth and the organizational capacity to undertake monumental construction. The system was still functioning, but the system had a flaw, and the flaw was structural. The longer Pepi reigned, the more the delicate balance of power between the pharaoh and the provincial nomarch shifted, slowly, incrementally, almost invisibly, toward the provinces. This was not because Pepi was a bad ruler. It was because the mechanism that held the Old Kingdom together depended on a regular cycle of royal succession. When a new pharaoh came to the throne, he reasserted central authority. He appointed new officials. He demanded new oaths of loyalty. He redistributed offices and estates among his supporters. He reminded the provincial governors, through a combination of patronage and implicit threat, that their power derived from the crown. But Pepi never died. Year after year, decade after decade, the same king sat on the throne, and as he aged, the governors who had been appointed in his youth grew old and were replaced by their sons, and then their grandsons, and then their great-grandsons. These new governors owed their positions not to the pharaoh, but to their families. They governed not because the king had chosen them, but because their fathers and grandfathers had governed before them. The office of nomarch, which had been an appointed position under the strong pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, was becoming hereditary, and hereditary governors have a fundamentally different relationship to central authority than appointed ones. An appointed official serves at the pleasure of the king. A hereditary lord serves at the pleasure of his own ambition. The transformation was not dramatic. No nomarch declared independence. No provincial army marched on Memphis. The change was atmospheric, a shift in attitude, in expectation, in the unspoken understanding of where power actually resided. It was the kind of change that historians can identify in retrospect, but that contemporaries rarely perceive, because the forms remain the same even after the substance has changed. The governor still bowed to the pharaoh's name. He still dated his inscriptions to the king's regnal year, but the bow was shallower than it used to be, and the inscriptions spent more words praising the governor than the king. The archaeological evidence for this shift is visible in the tombs. During the height of the Old Kingdom, high officials were buried near the king's pyramid, at Giza, at Saqqara, at Abbasia. Their tombs were gifts from the pharaoh, located in carefully planned cemeteries that radiated outward from the royal monument like planets orbiting a sun. To be buried near the king was the ultimate honor. It meant that in death, as in life, the official remained within the orbit of divine power. But during the 6th dynasty, and especially during the long decades of Pepi's reign, this pattern broke down. The tombs of provincial governors began to appear not at the royal necropolis, but at the capitals of their own nomes, at Ashyut, at Beni Hassan, at Deir el-Bersha, at Maya, at Kau el-Kabir. These are not small tombs. They are large, elaborately decorated, rock-cut chambers with biographical inscriptions that emphasize the governor's achievements in his own district. His management of local agriculture, his construction of local irrigation channels, his provision of food during times of scarcity, his maintenance of order. The pharaoh is mentioned, of course. He is still acknowledged as the source of authority, but the tone has shifted. The governor is no longer presenting himself as a servant of the crown. He is presenting himself as a benefactor of his people, a local king in all but name. The French Egyptologist Nicolas Grimault described this process with a precision that bears attention. He wrote that during Pepi's reign, the provincial administration gradually escaped from royal control, creating something that resembled a feudal system in which the nomarchs became virtually independent lords. That word feudal is important. It suggests a comparison to medieval Europe, where a weak central monarchy coexisted with powerful regional lords who controlled their own lands, armies, and revenues. The comparison is not exact, but it captures the essential dynamic. Power was flowing away from the centre and toward the periphery, and the longer Pepi lived, the faster it flowed. But here is the problem. Pepi could not reverse this process, even if he wanted to, because reversing it would have required a confrontation with the very elites who kept the kingdom running. The nomarchs were not rebels. They were loyal, in form, if not always in substance. They still performed the rituals. They still sent reports to Memphis. They still acknowledged the pharaoh's divine authority. But their actual behavior, their construction of independent tombs, their accumulation of local military forces, their intermarriage with other noble families, their hoarding of agricultural surplus, told a different story. It was the story of a state whose centre was holding in name only. A kingdom where the forms of obedience persisted long after the substance had evaporated, like a tree that looks healthy from the outside, but whose heartwood has rotted away. Still standing, still covered in leaves, but one strong wind from falling. And then the climate began to change. The 4.2 kiloyear event, as climatologists now call it, was one of the most severe episodes of arid conditions to affect the northern hemisphere in the last 5,000 years. The name itself, 4.2 kiloyear, refers to its approximate date, roughly 4,200 years before the present era, placing it squarely in the late 23rd century BC, during the latter portion of Pepi's reign. Evidence for this event comes from multiple independent sources, and the convergence of these datasets is what makes the case so compelling. Sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman show a spike in wind-blown dust, indicating increased aridity across the Near East. Ice cores from Mount Kilimanjaro reveal a dramatic reduction in precipitation in East Africa, the region that feeds the sources of the White Nile. Pollen records from the Levant show a shift from woodland to scrubland, indicating drying conditions across the eastern Mediterranean. Lake-level data from Lake Turkana and other East African basins show significant drops in water volume. Speleothem records, mineral deposits formed by dripping water in caves in Israel and Oman, show a sharp decline in rainfall that persisted for decades, perhaps centuries. The geochemist Harvey Weiss, working at Yale University, was among the first to connect this climate event to the collapse of civilizations across the Near East. His work at the site of Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria showed that the city, a thriving urban center under the Akkadian Empire, was abandoned around 2200 BC and covered by a thick layer of wind-blown soil, indicating that the region had become too dry for agriculture. Weiss argued that the drought was not a local phenomenon, but a mega-drought affecting the entire arc of civilization from Egypt to Mesopotamia. His conclusions were controversial when first published, but have been increasingly supported by subsequent research. The picture that emerges is consistent and stark. Beginning around 2200 BC, during the later decades of Pepi's reign, the climate of northeastern Africa became significantly drier. The monsoon systems that fed the sources of the Nile weakened. The annual flood, which Egyptian agriculture depended upon absolutely, began to fall short. In some years, the flood may have failed entirely. The consequences rippled outward from the riverbank. Canals that had carried water to fields beyond the immediate floodplain ran dry. Irrigation basins that had been carefully maintained for generations cracked and silted up. Crop yields plummeted, livestock died, and the people who depended on those crops and that livestock, the farmers, the fishermen, the artisans, the priests, found themselves facing a reality that the theology of the Old Kingdom had no mechanism to explain. The Nile was supposed to flood. The pharaoh was supposed to ensure that it flooded. If the flood failed, either the pharaoh had failed in his divine duty, or the gods themselves had abandoned Egypt. Neither conclusion was survivable for the system. For a civilization that had built its entire existence around the predictability of the Nile, this was catastrophic. The Egyptian farming system had virtually no reserves for prolonged drought. The narrow strip of cultivable land along the river meant that even a modest reduction in flood height could leave thousands of hectares unirrigated. A reduction of just 1 meter in the peak flood height could reduce the cultivable area by as much as a third. Grain stores that were designed to cushion a bad year or two could not sustain a population through a decade of repeated failure. And the centralized redistribution system that had once allowed the pharaoh to move surplus grain from prosperous regions to struggling ones was no longer functioning effectively because the provincial governors who controlled the granaries in their own districts were increasingly reluctant to surrender their surpluses to a distant capital whose authority they no longer feared. The result was famine. Not the kind of localized food shortage that Egypt had weathered many times before, but a prolonged, systemic failure of the food supply that affected the entire Nile Valley. The kind of famine that does not end in a season, but stretches across years, grinding down the social fabric until the most basic bonds of civilization, the duty of the strong to protect the weak, the obligation of the ruler to feed the ruled, simply dissolve under the pressure of survival. The evidence for this famine comes from a source that is almost unbearable to read. A text known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, a literary composition that describes conditions in Egypt during a time of social upheaval, paints a picture of a society in total disintegration. The text describes the Nile running dry, fields turning to dust, grain stores being plundered by the desperate, and the social order being completely overturned. Servants abandon their masters. The wealthy beg in the streets. The dead are thrown into the river because no one can afford proper burial. While scholars debate whether the Admonitions describes actual events or is a literary exercise in pessimism, and the date of the text itself is contested, the consistency of its themes with the archaeological evidence for the first intermediate period suggests that it reflects, at minimum, a genuine cultural memory of catastrophe. Another text, the Instruction addressed to King Merikare, written during the period that followed the Old Kingdom's collapse, refers explicitly to conditions in Upper Egypt during the late 6th dynasty. It describes a land where the south was dying of hunger, where local officials hoarded grain, and where the authority of the pharaoh was acknowledged in words but ignored in practice. The inscription of an official named Ankhesenpepi, a provincial governor of the third nome of Upper Egypt, who lived in the generation after Pepi, is even more explicit. Ankhesenpepi's tomb at Moala, south of Luxor, contains one of the most remarkable autobiographical texts from ancient Egypt. He describes finding his district in a state of near total collapse. He writes that all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, that people had come to eating their own children. He then describes his own efforts to feed the population, not on behalf of the pharaoh, but on his own authority, using his own resources, drawing on grain he had stored in his own granaries. He claims to have kept his people alive when the rest of the country was starving. He boasts, "I gave bread to the hungry and clothing to the naked. I anointed those who had no oil. I gave sandals to the barefoot. I gave a wife to him who had no wife." These are not the words of a man serving a functioning central state. These are the words of a man who has assumed the role of the state itself, who is feeding, clothing, and governing his people because no one else will. The king is barely mentioned in Ankhesenpepi's long inscription. The implication is devastating in its clarity. By the time Ankhesenpepi was governing, the central state had ceased to function in any meaningful sense. The pharaoh was a name on a monument. The real power, the power to feed people, to organize labor, to defend borders, belonged to men like Ankhesenpepi, and Ankhesenpepi knew it. His tomb inscription is not humble. It is triumphant. The declaration of a man who has filled the vacuum left by the collapse of royal authority, and who wants everyone to know that he, not the distant phantom on the throne at Memphis, is the one who matters. But when, exactly, did the collapse begin? This is where the scholarly debate becomes fierce, and where the figure of Pepi II himself becomes central. Some scholars argue that the breakdown of central authority was already well advanced during the last decades of Pepi's reign, that the aging king, isolated in his palace at Memphis, presided over a government that existed in name only while real power was exercised by the provincial lords. The American Egyptologist Barbara Bell, in a landmark paper published in the 1970s, argued that the climate deterioration began during Pepi's reign, and that the failure of the Nile floods was the primary driver of the collapse. Bell's analysis of later Nile flood records suggested a pattern of catastrophically low floods that would have made large-scale agriculture impossible across much of the valley. Others, including the British Egyptologist John Baines, have emphasized the political factors, arguing that the decentralization of power was the more fundamental cause, and that the climate crisis merely accelerated a process that was already underway. Baines pointed to the growing autonomy of the nomarchs, the depletion of the royal treasury, and the loss of institutional flexibility that came with an excessively long reign. In his analysis, even if the Nile had continued to flood normally, the Old Kingdom would have eventually fragmented. The structural weaknesses were too deep, the provincial elites too entrenched, the central bureaucracy too hollowed out. Still others, including the German scholar Stefan Zeidelmeier, have argued that the system held together, however tenuously, until Pepi's death, and that it was the succession crisis that followed, the rapid turnover of short-lived and ineffective rulers, that triggered the final collapse. Zeidelmeier's detailed analysis of funerary culture in Upper Egypt showed that the transition was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual transformation. A slow unraveling that played out differently in different regions over the course of several decades. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The system was weakened during Pepi's reign. The climate crisis accelerated the weakening, and the death of the pharaoh, the one figure around whom the entire ideology of the state was organized, delivered the final blow. The collapse was not one event, it was a cascade, each failure triggering the next, each weakness exposing another, until the entire structure came apart like a building whose foundations have been quietly dissolving for years. The immediate aftermath of Pepi's death is a period of almost complete obscurity. The ancient sources mention a handful of rulers who followed him, his successor Merenre II, who may have reigned for only a single year, and a mysterious figure named Nitocris, whom Manetho describes as the noblest and most beautiful woman of her time, who became pharaoh and then, according to one account, killed herself. Herodotus, the Greek historian writing 2,000 years later, tells a dramatic story about Nitocris, that she avenged her brother's murder by inviting his killers to a banquet in an underground chamber, then flooding the chamber with Nile water, drowning them all, before taking her own life to escape retribution. The historicity of this story is almost certainly fictional. It has the structure of a folk tale, not a historical account. Some scholars believe Nitocris is based on a real queen who briefly held power during the chaos of the succession crisis. Others believe she is a literary invention, a narrative device used by later writers to symbolize the end of an era, a kingdom so broken that even its last ruler chose death over rule. In either case, the message is the same. The Sixth Dynasty ended not with a bang but with a whisper, a succession of obscure, powerless rulers who could not command the loyalty of a kingdom that had already fragmented into competing provinces. The period that followed, the First Intermediate Period, lasting roughly from 2180 to around 2055 BC, is one of the least documented and most debated eras in Egyptian history. For generations, Egyptologists described it as a dark age, a time of famine, civil war, and cultural decline that separated the glories of the Old Kingdom from the renaissance of the Middle Kingdom. The imagery was powerful. A civilization that had built the pyramids reduced to warring provinces, its people starving, its gods abandoned. The German Egyptologist Wolfgang Helck argued that the First Intermediate Period represented a genuine social revolution, the first time in Egyptian history that the lower classes rose against the established order. The Admonitions of Ipua was read as evidence for this thesis. Its descriptions of servants taking the property of their masters, of the poor becoming rich, and the rich becoming beggars, seem to describe a world turned upside down. More recent scholarship has complicated this picture significantly. The British Egyptologist Stefan Seidelmeyer, working with a comprehensive database of funerary stelae from Upper Egypt, demonstrated that the First Intermediate Period was not a uniform catastrophe. Some regions of Egypt, particularly in Upper Egypt, where strong nomarchs maintained order, experienced relative stability even during the worst of the crisis. Seidelmeyer's analysis of burial practices showed that while the quality of grave goods declined in some areas, in others it actually improved, as local elites invested in their own communities rather than sending wealth to a distant capital. Art and literature continued to be produced, though in different styles and with different themes than the Old Kingdom. The coffin paintings of the First Intermediate Period, while simpler than the tomb art of the Old Kingdom, reveal a society that was adapting, painfully, unevenly, but genuinely, to a new reality. Provincial workshops developed their own artistic traditions, free from the rigid conventions of the royal ateliers at Memphis. In some ways, the art of this period is more personal, more emotionally expressive than anything the Old Kingdom had produced. Freedom from the centre brought a kind of artistic liberation, even as it brought political chaos. Yet the scale of suffering during the worst years was real. Analysis of skeletal remains from cemeteries dating to the late 6th dynasty and early First Intermediate Period shows evidence of malnutrition, stunted growth, and stress markers on bones, the physical signatures of famine inscribed on the bodies of the dead. Children's graves from this period show a higher mortality rate than the preceding centuries. At Elephantine, the island fortress at the First Cataract, Nile flood records, measured by nilometers carved into the island's granite, show a marked decline in flood height during the decades around 2200 BC. The Nile, which had sustained Egyptian civilization for a millennium, was failing, and without the Nile, Egypt was nothing but desert. But the fact remains that the centralized state that had built the pyramids was gone. The institution of divine kingship, which had governed Egypt for over 8 centuries, had collapsed, and the texts that survive from this period are haunted by a sense of bewildered grief. A people trying to understand how the world they had known, the world they had believed was eternal, had simply vanished. The Dialogue of a Man with His Soul, one of the most profound literary texts from the period after the collapse, captures this mood with devastating clarity. In it, a man contemplates ending his own life because the world has become unbearable. He describes a society where no one can be trusted, where the old bonds of loyalty have dissolved, where brothers betray each other and friends become strangers, where the dead are envied because at least they are at peace. He says that death is before him like the recovery of a sick man, like going out after being confined. Death is before him like the fragrance of myrrh, like sitting under a sail on a breezy day. His soul argues with him, tells him to embrace life, to find pleasure in the present, but the man cannot be consoled. He has seen too much. The world he knew is gone. Another text from this era, the Prophecy of Neferti, describes a sage who foretells a time when the sun will be dimmed, the river will run dry, and the people of Egypt will be scattered like a herd without a shepherd. The imagery is apocalyptic, a vision of total civilizational failure expressed in the language of cosmic disorder. Whether these texts describe actual events or express literary anxieties, they reveal something profound about the psychological aftermath of the Old Kingdom's collapse. The Egyptians did not simply lose a government. They lost a worldview. The certainties that had ordered their existence for 8 centuries, the divine kingship, the eternal flood, the unbreakable order of Mat, had been exposed as fragile, contingent, mortal, and that exposure left a wound in Egyptian culture that would take centuries to heal. The text is literary, not documentary, but the despair it expresses is not invented. It is the voice of a civilization that has lost its center, a people who once believed that their king was a god, that the Nile would always flood, that the cosmic order would always hold, and who have been forced to confront the possibility that none of those things were guaranteed. Something is wrong with our assumptions when we look at this collapse and try to find a single cause. The reality is that the fall of the Old Kingdom was overdetermined, meaning that multiple causes, each sufficient on its own to cause serious damage, converged at the same moment in history. The climate dried, the Nile floods weakened, the provincial governors gained independence, the royal treasury was depleted by centuries of tax exemptions and monumental construction. The king grew old, impossibly old, and lost the ability or the will to assert his authority. And the ideology that held the system together, the belief that the pharaoh was divine, that his power was absolute, that the cosmic order depended on his person, could not survive the spectacle of a kingdom that could no longer feed its people, while its god-king sat silent in his palace. The collapse of the Old Kingdom is not just an Egyptian story, it is a universal one. It is the story of what happens when institutions outlive their capacity for renewal, when the structures that once enabled greatness become the structures that prevent adaptation. The Old Kingdom did not fall because it was weak, it fell because it was rigid. It had built a system so perfectly calibrated to stability that it could not absorb change. And Pepi II, the longest reigning ruler in history, was both the last beneficiary of that system and its final victim. He was the man who held the throne so long that the throne itself lost its meaning. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The people who lived through the collapse did not see it coming. The inscriptions from the middle of Pepi's reign are confident, boastful, full of the standard formulas of royal power. There is no hint of anxiety, no suggestion that the writers sensed what was approaching. The crisis, when it arrived, came not as a dramatic event, but as a slow accumulation of small failures, each one manageable on its own, each one invisible to those who were living through it, until the accumulated weight became unbearable and the entire structure gave way. That is the nature of systemic collapse. It does not announce itself. It arrives in disguise, wearing the clothes of normalcy, until the day it takes off the mask and reveals that the world you knew has already ended. The story of Pepi II is, in one sense, a story about Egypt, but in another sense, a deeper and more unsettling sense, it is a story about a pattern that repeats across the ancient world, across millennia, across continents. Because Egypt was not the only civilization that collapsed around this time. It was not the only kingdom that reached extraordinary heights of achievement and then fell into darkness. And the most haunting thing about the pattern is not the collapses themselves. It is how similar they look every time, even when the civilizations that produced them had no knowledge of each other's existence. To understand what happened to Pepi's Egypt, we need to step outside the Nile Valley and look at what was happening in the rest of the ancient world, both at the same time and at other moments in history, because the fall of the Old Kingdom was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader crisis that swept across the ancient Near East around 2200 BC, and it resonates with collapses that happened centuries earlier and centuries later, in places as far apart as the Indus Valley and the American Southwest, the jungles of Southeast Asia, and the grasslands of Central North America. Let us begin with Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now Iraq. At the same time that Pepi II was aging on his throne in Memphis, the Akkadian Empire, the first true empire in human history, was dying. The Akkadian Empire had been founded around 2334 BC by a man named Sargon, who had risen from obscure origins to conquer the independent city-states of Sumer and unite them under a single ruler. At its peak, the Akkadian Empire controlled territory from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, governing a population of perhaps several million people across a vast arc of fertile land. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, declared himself a living god, the first Mesopotamian king to do so. and his inscriptions describe a ruler at the height of his power, commanding armies, building monuments, and receiving tribute from distant lands. And then it ended. Around 2154 BC, the last Akkadian king, Shar-Kali-Shari, was overthrown or killed, and the empire fragmented. The ancient Sumerian king list records the chaos that followed with a single devastating question: who was king? Who was not king? This is not a scribal error. It is a description of a world that had lost its center, a world where the very concept of legitimate authority had collapsed along with the institutions that supported it. The parallels with Egypt's first intermediate period are striking, and they are not coincidental. Harvey Weiss's excavations at Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria revealed that the city, a major Akkadian administrative center, was abandoned around 2200 BC and buried under a meter of wind-blown dust. The soil itself tells the story. The land had dried out, the rains had failed, the agriculture that sustained the empire could no longer function. The same drought that weakened the Nile floods that sustained Pepi's Egypt also destroyed the agricultural base of the Akkadian Empire over 1,000 kilometers to the east. The math is striking. Two of the most powerful civilizations on Earth, ancient Egypt and the Akkadian Empire, collapsed within a few decades of each other, separated by vast distances, with no direct military conflict between them. The common thread was not war, it was climate. The 4.2 kiloyear event did not discriminate. It struck every civilization in its path with the same weapon, a prolonged failure of the rains that sustained agriculture. And the civilizations that fell were not the weak ones, they were the strong ones, the ones that had built the most complex, the most centralized, the most resource-dependent systems. They fell precisely because their sophistication made them fragile. A simple farming village can survive a drought by moving to a river or switching to a hardier crop. An empire of millions, dependent on centralized grain distribution and bureaucratic coordination, cannot adapt that quickly. The very systems that enabled their greatness became the systems that ensured their destruction. This pattern, the paradox of strength becoming weakness, deserves closer attention because it is the thread that connects every collapse we are about to examine. The civilizations that survive environmental stress are not necessarily the most powerful, they are the most flexible. And flexibility is precisely what highly centralized, highly hierarchical systems tend to lose as they mature. The institutions that once enabled rapid response become layers of bureaucracy that slow response to a crawl. The trade networks that once brought diverse resources become supply chains vulnerable to disruption at any point. The ideology that once unified the population becomes a rigid orthodoxy that cannot accommodate new realities. This is not a failure of intelligence, it is a structural feature of complexity itself. But the collapse at 2200 BC is only one chapter in a much longer story. Let us move southeast to the Indus Valley, to what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Here, between roughly 2600 and 1900 BC, according to current scholarly estimates, a civilization flourished that rivaled Egypt and Mesopotamia in size, sophistication, and mystery. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, after the first major site excavated, covered an area of approximately 1.3 million square kilometers, making it the largest of the three Great Bronze Age civilizations. Its two greatest cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, had populations estimated at 30 to 50,000 each. They had grid-planned streets. They had standardized brick sizes across hundreds of kilometers. They had sophisticated drainage systems and indoor plumbing. They had a system of weights and measures so uniform that a set of stone weights from Mohenjo-Daro matches almost exactly a set from Harappa 500 kilometers away. In 1922, an Indian archaeologist named Rahaldas Bandyopadhyay, known in the literature as R.D. Banerjee, arrived at a site in the Sindh province of what was then British India. He had come to investigate a Buddhist stupa, a domed structure used for meditation, that was known to exist on a large mound near the Indus River. But as Banerjee began to dig, he found something beneath the stupa that was far older than Buddhism. He found walls. He found streets. He found bricks, millions of bricks, laid with extraordinary precision, forming buildings that had been buried under centuries of river silt. What Banerjee had discovered was Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead, one of the largest and most sophisticated cities of the ancient world, and it had been sitting beneath the Pakistani desert, completely forgotten, for nearly 4,000 years. The excavations that followed, led by Sir John Marshall and later by Sir Mortimer Wheeler, revealed a city that defied every assumption about Bronze Age civilization. Mohenjo-Daro had no palace, it had no grand temple, it had no monumental statue of a king. What it had was infrastructure. The Great Bath, a large waterproof pool in the centre of the city, is the oldest known public water tank in the world, lined with bitumen to prevent leakage. The streets were laid out on a grid, with major avenues running north-south and east-west. Nearly every house had its own bathroom and toilet, connected to a city-wide drainage system that ran beneath the streets in covered brick channels. The drains were cleaned and maintained by civic workers. This level of urban sanitation would not be matched in Europe until the Roman Empire 2,000 years later, and after Rome fell, it would not be matched again until the 19th century. And then, sometime around 1900 BC, the Indus Valley civilization collapsed. The great cities were abandoned. The standardized weights disappeared. The script, which has never been deciphered, stopped being used. The population dispersed into smaller, simpler settlements scattered across the landscape. And unlike Egypt, where the civilization eventually recovered and reconstituted itself under the Middle Kingdom, the Indus Valley civilization never returned. It vanished. Its cities were buried. Its language was forgotten. Its people were absorbed into later cultures. For nearly 4,000 years, no one knew it had existed. What destroyed it? The debate continues, and it is one of the most contentious in all of archaeology. Earlier theories focused on invasion, the idea that Aryan peoples from Central Asia had swept down through the mountain passes and destroyed the Harappan cities by force. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who excavated at Mohenjo-Daro in the 1940s, famously pointed to a group of skeletons found in the upper levels of the city as evidence of a violent end. He argued that these bodies, scattered in the streets, some with apparent trauma marks, were victims of an Aryan assault, and he identified the Vedic war god Indra as the literary memory of the real destroyer. This theory, once dominant, has been largely abandoned by modern scholarship. Reanalysis of the skeletal evidence showed that the bones dated to different periods and could not represent a single massacre. There is no convincing evidence of large-scale warfare at the major sites, no systematic burning, no fortification walls breached by assault, no mass graves. Wheeler's dramatic narrative, compelling as it was, did not survive closer scrutiny. The more recent consensus points to environmental factors, a combination of shifting river patterns, declining monsoon rains, and possibly tectonic activity that altered the course of the rivers the civilization depended on. The Gagahakra river system, which once flowed through the heart of the Harappan territory, appears to have dried up or shifted its course during the 2nd millennium BC, removing the water source that sustained hundreds of settlements. The parallel with Egypt is haunting. Once again, a civilization built its entire existence around a river system, and once again, when the water changed, the civilization could not adapt. But here is the problem. The environmental explanation, while compelling, does not fully account for the scale of the collapse. Other river civilizations have survived droughts and floods. The Nile itself has varied enormously over the millennia, and Egyptian civilization persisted. What made the Indus Valley civilization uniquely vulnerable? Some scholars have suggested that the Harappan political system, whatever form it took, may have been unable to coordinate a response to a crisis that affected the entire region simultaneously. Unlike Egypt, which had a centralized government capable of redistributing resources, the Indus Valley civilization appears to have been more decentralized, perhaps organized as a network of semi-independent cities rather than a unified state. Without a central authority to coordinate migration, resource sharing, or infrastructure repair, each city faced the crisis alone, and one by one, they failed. Now let us cross the world entirely and move to the American Southwest. Here in the arid canyons and mesas of what is now New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, a people we now call the ancestral Puebloans, formerly and inaccurately known as the Anasazi, a Navajo word meaning ancient enemies, that the Pueblo peoples themselves consider inappropriate, built one of the most extraordinary civilizations in pre-Columbian North America. Between roughly 850 and 1250 AD, they constructed elaborate multi-story stone buildings, developed sophisticated irrigation systems, maintained trade networks that extended hundreds of kilometers, and created some of the most striking architectural monuments on the continent. The center of their world was Chaco Canyon, a shallow desert valley in northwestern New Mexico that receives less than 23 centimeters of rainfall per year, barely enough to sustain life. And yet, hidden in this unlikely landscape, lie the ruins of at least a dozen great houses. Massive sandstone structures, some with hundreds of rooms, built with walls so precisely fitted that a knife blade cannot be inserted between the stones. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The builders selected their stone with care, shaping each block to fit its neighbors, creating walls that are both structurally sound and visually elegant, banded patterns of large and small stones that give the buildings a distinctive aesthetic that archaeologists can identify at a glance. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, contained over 600 rooms, rose 4 stories high, and covered an area of roughly 2 acres. It may have been the largest building in North America until the construction of apartment buildings in New York in the 1880s. That means that for approximately 800 years, nothing built on the continent surpassed a structure erected in a desert canyon by people without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals, using nothing but stone, timber, and human labor. Roads, wide, straight, carefully graded, radiated outward from Chaco Canyon to outlying communities dozens of kilometers away. These roads were not simply paths worn by foot traffic. They were engineered structures, cut into the bedrock, cleared of vegetation, and maintained over generations. Some of them are perfectly straight for distances of over 60 kilometers, cutting through hills rather than going around them, suggesting that their straightness was not practical but symbolic, a physical expression of the connection between the center and the periphery. The purpose of these roads is still debated. They may have served as ceremonial pathways, trade routes, astronomical alignments, or lines of political authority, connecting the center to the periphery. Whatever their purpose, their construction required planning, coordination, and sustained labor on a scale that contradicts any notion of the ancestral Puebloans as simple desert farmers. At its peak, the Chaco system may have coordinated activities across an area of over 100,000 square kilometers, involving dozens of communities and thousands of people. Exotic goods found at Chaco, including cacao from Mesoamerica, macaw feathers from the tropics, and turquoise from distant mines, indicate that the Chacoan elite participated in trade networks that stretched from present-day Mexico to the Great Plains. Archaeologist Stephen Lexson called Chaco Canyon the political and spiritual center of the ancient Southwest, a place whose influence shaped the lives of people across an enormous region. And then, around 1150 AD, Chaco Canyon was abandoned. The great houses were emptied, the roads fell into disuse. The population moved away, some to the north toward Mesa Verde, some to the south toward the Rio Grande. The reasons are familiar by now. Tree ring data, the science of dendrochronology, which allows archaeologists to reconstruct rainfall patterns year by year from the growth rings of ancient timber, shows that the mid-1200s were marked by a catastrophic drought that lasted approximately 25 years. This drought, known as the Great Drought, struck between roughly 1276 and 1299 AD and was one of the most severe in the last 2,000 years of the region's climate record. But the abandonment of Chaco began before the Great Drought, during an earlier period of drying in the late 1100s. Once again, the pattern repeats. A sophisticated civilization, dependent on carefully managed water resources, encounters a sustained shift in climate and cannot adapt. The archaeologist Timothy Kohler, who has studied the population dynamics of the ancient Southwest for decades, noted that the ancestral Puebloans did not simply leave because of drought. They left because the social systems that managed drought had broken down. In good years, the Chacoan network redistributed surplus food from prosperous communities to struggling ones. But as the drought persisted and surpluses vanished, the system of redistribution collapsed. Communities that had once cooperated began to compete. Violence increased. Skeletal evidence from late Puebloan sites shows a marked rise in traumatic injuries suggesting warfare or raiding. Trust evaporated. And without trust, the networks that had sustained Chacoan civilization for over 2 centuries could not function. The buildings stood, but the society that had built them was already gone. Now let us turn to Southeast Asia, to the jungles of what is now Cambodia, where the greatest city of the medieval world lies hidden beneath the canopy. The Khmer Empire, centered on the city of Angkor, was one of the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations in human history. At its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries AD, Angkor covered an area of approximately 1,000 square kilometers, making it, according to recent satellite and LiDAR mapping, the most extensive urban complex of the pre-industrial world. Its population may have reached 750,000 or more. The Temple of Angkor Wat, built by King Suryavarman II in the early 12th century, is the largest religious monument ever constructed. A mountain of stone rising from the jungle floor, its walls covered with nearly 2,000 square meters of bas-relief carvings depicting scenes from Hindu mythology and Khmer court life. The discovery of Angkor's true extent is a story of modern technology revealing what the jungle had concealed for centuries. In 2012, a team led by Australian archaeologist Damien Evans used airborne LiDAR, a laser scanning technology that can penetrate forest canopy and map the ground surface beneath, to survey the area around Angkor. The results were astonishing. Beneath the jungle, the LiDAR revealed a vast urban landscape. Roads, canals, reservoirs, residential blocks, and agricultural fields, stretching far beyond the known temple complexes. Evans later described the moment the data appeared on his screen as one of the most extraordinary experiences of his career. The city was enormous, far larger than anyone had imagined, and it had been invisible, hidden beneath the trees, for more than 500 years. But the LiDAR survey revealed something else, something that explained not just Angkor's greatness, but its downfall. The Khmer Empire had built one of the most elaborate water management systems in the pre-industrial world, enormous reservoirs called barays, the largest of which, the West Barai, measured 8 kilometers long by 2.3 kilometers wide, collected monsoon rainwater and distributed it through a network of canals and channels to rice paddies throughout the urban area. This hydraulic system was the engine of Angkor's power. It enabled intensive rice cultivation that could support a massive population and generate the surplus wealth that funded the empire's monumental construction. The city was, in the words of one historian, a hydraulic civilization, a society whose very existence depended on the management of water. And it gets stranger. The LiDAR data showed that the hydraulic system had been modified, expanded, repaired, and reworked repeatedly over the centuries. Evidence of a society constantly struggling to manage its water supply. Some of these modifications appear to have been emergency measures, hasty repairs, ad hoc channels, desperate attempts to redirect water where it was most needed. The system, in other words, was under strain, and when the strain became too great, when a prolonged period of unstable monsoons struck the region in the 14th and 15th centuries, alternating between severe droughts and catastrophic floods, the hydraulic system failed. Canals silted up, reservoirs overflowed or ran dry. The rice harvests that fed the city collapsed. The city does not die all at once. The process takes decades, perhaps a century. The outer districts empty first. Farmers abandon their fields and move closer to the water sources that still function. The great temples, starved of the labor and resources needed to maintain them, begin to deteriorate. Roots crack the stone, moss covers the carvings. The administrative apparatus that coordinated the hydraulic system loses its capacity to function as skilled engineers die or leave and are not replaced. The last known Sanskrit inscription at Angkor dates to 1327 AD. After that, silence. The Khmer court eventually relocated to Phnom Penh, and Angkor was left to the jungle. When Henri Mouhot, the French naturalist often credited with bringing Angkor to Western attention, Arrived in 1860, he found the temples engulfed by enormous fig and silk cotton trees, their roots wrapping around the carved walls like the fingers of something ancient and patient. He wrote in his journal that the site was grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. That assessment was not exaggerated. Angkor Wat alone is larger than the Vatican City, and it is only one building among hundreds in a city that, at its height, made every European city of the same era look like a provincial town. It is worth pausing on what was lost when Angkor fell, not just the physical city, but the knowledge that built it. The Khmer engineers who designed the barrage system understood hydrology with the sophistication that modern water engineers have studied with respect. They knew how to calculate water flow, how to manage sediment, how to distribute water across thousands of hectares of rice paddies, with sufficient precision to feed 750,000 people. This knowledge was not written in textbooks. It was embedded in practice, in the daily work of canal maintenance, in the generational transmission of skill from master to apprentice, in the institutional memory of a bureaucracy that coordinated water management across an area larger than many modern cities. When the bureaucracy failed, when the engineers died or left, and their apprentices scattered, the knowledge went with them. It was not destroyed by fire or flood. It simply evaporated, as knowledge always does when the institutions that preserve it cease to function. The canals silted up, not because no one wanted to clean them, but because no one alive remembered how they worked. The distinction matters enormously. Civilizational collapse does not just destroy infrastructure, it destroys the knowledge needed to rebuild it. And knowledge, once lost, is far harder to recover than stone. And then there is the most dramatic collapse of all, the one that swallowed not a single civilization, but an entire international system. Around 1200 BC, roughly 1,000 years after the fall of the Old Kingdom, the interconnected civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a catastrophe so total that historians call it simply the Bronze Age collapse. Within the span of roughly 50 years, the Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient world, controlling most of modern-day Turkey and northern Syria, ceased to exist. The Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, the civilization that would later inspire Homer's tales of Troy and Agamemnon, were destroyed and abandoned. Cities along the Levantine coast, Ugarit, a thriving port city whose scribes wrote in 7 languages, Hattusa, the mighty Hittite capital fortified with massive stone walls, were burned and never rebuilt. The international trade networks that had connected Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Greece and the Levant in a complex web of diplomatic correspondence, gift exchange, and commercial shipping collapsed entirely. The last letter ever sent from Ugarit, discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century, is a desperate plea for help. The writer describes enemy ships appearing off the coast, reports that the city's army and fleet are deployed elsewhere, and begs for immediate military assistance. The letter was never answered, the city was burned, and the entire system of interconnected Bronze Age states, a system that had functioned for centuries, producing some of the finest art, literature, and architecture the ancient world had known, was gone. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse remain fiercely debated. The ancient sources mention mysterious invaders called the Sea Peoples, groups of raiders who attacked Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia in waves during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Ramesses III of Egypt recorded a great naval battle against the Sea Peoples in his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, claiming a decisive victory. But the identity of the Sea Peoples remains uncertain, and most modern scholars believe they were a symptom rather than a cause, displaced populations set in motion by the very collapse they were blamed for creating. More recent scholarship has emphasized a familiar combination of factors: climate change, particularly a prolonged drought evident in pollen records from the Eastern Mediterranean, systemic fragility in the tightly interconnected trade networks, where the failure of one node could cascade through the entire system, internal social upheaval as populations burdened by elite extraction turned against their rulers, and the inherent vulnerability of societies that had grown too complex, too interdependent, and too specialized to absorb simultaneous shocks from multiple directions. The archaeologist Eric Klein, in his study of the Bronze Age collapse, compared the event to a modern systemic failure, not a single blow, but a cascade of interconnected crises, each one amplifying the others until the entire structure gave way. The parallel with the 21st century, as Klein himself noted with some discomfort, is difficult to ignore. The pattern is now unmistakable. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the American Southwest, the Khmer Empire, the Bronze Age Mediterranean. 6 civilizations separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, each reaching extraordinary heights of achievement, each dependent on carefully managed environmental resources and complex social systems, each destroyed when those resources failed, and the systems that managed them could not adapt. But we would be incomplete without mentioning one more collapse. Perhaps the most dramatic of all, the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BC, roughly 1,000 years after the fall of the Old Kingdom, the entire eastern Mediterranean, a region containing some of the most advanced civilizations on Earth, underwent a catastrophic systemic failure. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled Anatolia for centuries and rivaled Egypt in military power, was destroyed and its capital Hattusa burned. The Mycenaean palatial civilization of Greece, the world of Agamemnon and the Trojan War, the civilization that had built the massive Cyclopean walls of Mycenae and Tiryns, collapsed entirely. Its writing system, Linear B, fell out of use. Greece would not become literate again for nearly 400 years. The great trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was destroyed. Cyprus was ravaged. Egypt survived, but barely. The new kingdom fought off waves of attacks by the mysterious Sea Peoples, a coalition of raiders whose identity is still debated, but the effort drained the kingdom's resources and contributed to its eventual decline. The scale of the Bronze Age collapse is staggering. Imagine if every major power in the modern world, every advanced industrial nation, simultaneously lost the ability to function. That is roughly what happened in the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. Trade networks that had connected Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and the Levantine coast for centuries were severed. Technologies were lost. Cities that had been occupied for millennia were abandoned. The period that followed, sometimes called the Greek Dark Ages in the Aegean context, was one of profound regression in material culture, literacy, and political organization. The archaeologist Eric Klein, in his comprehensive study of the Bronze Age collapse, argued that the catastrophe was not caused by any single factor, but by a perfect storm of interconnected crises: earthquake, drought, famine, invasion, and the disruption of international trade, all striking simultaneously at societies that had become deeply interdependent. The interconnectedness that had made the Late Bronze Age so prosperous, the trade in copper, tin, gold, grain, and luxury goods that linked every major civilization in the region, also made it catastrophically vulnerable to cascade failure. When one node in the network collapsed, the shock propagated outward, destabilizing partners and dependencies that had seemed secure. It was, in Klein's words, a systems collapse, a failure not of individual civilizations but of the network that connected them. The details differ from case to case, the scale differs, the geography differs, but the underlying story is the same. Human civilizations build systems of extraordinary complexity, and those systems are precisely as strong as the environmental and social conditions that sustain them. When those conditions change, when the river dries, the rains fail, the monsoon shifts, the complexity becomes a liability. The more intricate the system, the more catastrophic its failure. And there is one more example that demands attention, not because it is the largest or the most dramatic, but because it is the most mysterious and the most relevant to North American listeners. Cahokia. In the floodplain of the Mississippi River, just east of modern-day St. Louis, Missouri, there was once a city. Around 1100 AD, it was the largest settlement north of Mexico. Its population may have reached 20,000 or more, comparable to London at the same time, larger than any city in what would become the United States, until Philadelphia surpassed it in the late 18th century. At its center stood Monk's Mound, an enormous earthen platform, the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas, rising over 30 meters above the surrounding plain, and covering an area of roughly 5.5 hectares at its base. The mound is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built entirely by hand, basket load by basket load, over the course of several centuries. Around it lay over 100 smaller mounds, burial mounds, platform mounds, ridgetop mounds, arranged in patterns that suggest careful planning and cosmological significance. A grand plaza stretched before Monk's Mound, large enough to hold thousands of people for ceremonies and gatherings. A wooden palisade wall, a fortification of massive timber posts, surrounded the central precinct, and a circle of wooden posts, known as Woodhenge, functioned as a solar calendar, marking the equinoxes and solstices with a precision that required sophisticated astronomical observation. Cahokia's existence shattered the assumption that complex urban civilization in North America required European contact. This was a city built entirely by indigenous peoples, using locally available materials, sustained by the intensive cultivation of maize in the rich floodplain soils of the Mississippi bottomlands. The organization required to construct Monk's Mound, which contains an estimated 622,000 cubic meters of earth, all moved by hand in woven baskets, implies a labor force of thousands working over generations and a leadership structure capable of coordinating massive collective projects. Recent excavations have revealed evidence of large-scale feasting, craft specialization, long-distance trade in exotic materials like copper from the Great Lakes and shell from the Gulf Coast, and a social hierarchy that included elites buried with elaborate grave goods. One burial at Cahokia, known as Mound 72, contained the remains of a man laid on a platform of over 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird. Surrounding him were the bodies of over 250 other individuals, many of them young women who appear to have been sacrificed. The discovery shocked the archaeological community. It suggested a level of political power and ritual authority at Cahokia that went far beyond what had previously been imagined for any pre-Columbian society north of Mexico. And then, by 1400 AD, Cahokia was empty. The mound stood silent. The plazas were overgrown. The people had dispersed into smaller communities scattered across the region. No European had set foot in the area. No foreign army had arrived. The city simply ceased to exist. The reasons are debated. Deforestation, flood damage, political instability, resource depletion, and localized climate change have all been proposed. But no single explanation has achieved consensus. What is clear is that Cahokia collapse followed the same trajectory as every other example in this survey. A period of rapid growth and centralization, followed by environmental stress, followed by social fragmentation, followed by abandonment. The archaeologist Timothy Pauktat, who has dedicated his career to studying Cahokia, described the site with a reverence that borders on grief. He wrote that Cahokia represents a lost possibility, a vision of what indigenous North American civilization might have become if the trajectory had continued. Instead, by the time Europeans arrived in the Mississippi Valley, Cahokia was a memory, a ruin that even the local Native American communities could not fully explain. The mounds stood in the floodplain like monuments to a world that no longer existed. And for centuries, European settlers refused to believe that indigenous peoples could have built them, attributing them instead to lost races, ancient Egyptians, or Welsh explorers, an act of cultural erasure that compounded the original loss. The story of Cahokia carries a particular sting because its collapse was so total that even its memory was nearly destroyed. Unlike Egypt, where the pyramids remained visible and the hieroglyphs awaited decipherment, Cahokia's earthen mounds were gradually ploughed under by farmers, built over by suburbs, and ignored by a society that could not reconcile their existence with its assumptions about the peoples who had lived in North America before European contact. It was not until the 20th century that systematic archaeological investigation began to reveal the true scale and sophistication of the site. And even now, much of what Cahokia was, its political organization, its religious beliefs, its reasons for collapse, remains unknown, buried in the soil of a floodplain that has been farmed and developed for 2 centuries. Knowledge that was not preserved in stone or text, knowledge carried only in living memory, in oral tradition, in the daily practices of a people, vanished when those people dispersed. The loss is incalculable, and it is irreversible. Let that sink in. 6 civilizations, 6 collapses, 6 stories of human achievement reaching its peak and then falling into silence. And in every case, the collapse was not caused by a single dramatic event, an invasion, an earthquake, a plague. It was caused by the slow accumulation of pressures that the system could no longer absorb. Climate change, resource depletion, institutional rigidity, the concentration of power in structures too brittle to bend. And in every case, the people who lived through the collapse did not see it coming, because the collapse arrived wearing the mask of normalcy, disguised as a bad year, a dry season, a political disagreement, until the day the mask came off and revealed that the world they knew had already ended. There is a word that archaeologists use for this phenomenon, though they use it with caution. The word is resilience, or rather, the lack of it. A resilient system is one that can absorb shocks, adapt to changing conditions, and reorganize itself without losing its essential function. A fragile system is one that appears strong under normal conditions, but shatters when the conditions change. And the archaeological record suggests, with disturbing consistency, that civilizations tend to become more fragile as they become more complex. The early stages of a civilization, the formative period, when institutions are new and flexible, when populations are small enough to relocate, when leaders are close enough to the people to understand their needs, tend to be remarkably resilient. It is the mature stages that are dangerous. The stages when the institutions have calcified, when the bureaucracies have grown so large that they exist primarily to perpetuate themselves, when the leadership has become so insulated by layers of protocol and privilege that it can no longer perceive the reality on the ground. That is when the system becomes brittle. That is when a drought that might have been weathered in earlier centuries becomes a death sentence. The anthropologist Jared Diamond, in his comparative study of societal collapses, identified a pattern he called landscape amnesia, the tendency of societies to lose awareness of the environmental changes that are slowly undermining their existence, because the changes happen too gradually for any single generation to perceive. A farmer whose grandfather remembered abundant Nile floods, whose father remembered adequate floods, and who himself experiences mediocre floods does not perceive a crisis. He perceives normality. The gradual becomes the expected. The declining becomes the standard. And by the time the decline reaches catastrophic levels, the institutional memory of what normal once looked like has been lost. This is what happened to Pepi's Egypt. This is what happened to the Akkadian Empire, to the cities of the Indus, to Chaco Canyon, to Angkor, to the Bronze Age Mediterranean, to Kokia. The baseline shifted. The abnormal became normal, and the normal became a trap. What makes this pattern so unsettling is not that it happened. It is that it happened to civilizations that were, by any reasonable measure, smarter, more organized, and more capable than the ones that preceded them. The old kingdom of Egypt did not collapse because it was primitive. It collapsed because it was sophisticated. And its sophistication created dependencies that its simpler predecessors had never faced. A nomadic herder can survive a drought by moving. A farmer with irrigation can survive a drought by drawing on stored water. But a civilization of 1.5 million people, governed by a divine king whose legitimacy depends on the annual flood, supported by a bureaucracy that requires grain taxes to function, defended by armies that require food to march, that civilization has no margin for error. Every element depends on every other element. Remove one, and the rest begin to fail. There is a moment, somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning, when the mind stops defending itself against difficult ideas. The usual barriers, the optimism, the assumption that our world is different, the confidence that what we have built is permanent, those barriers come down in the quiet hours, and that is when the weight of everything we have just described begins to settle. Think about what we have covered. A boy became king. He ruled for nearly a century. By the time he died, the institutions that sustained his kingdom had hollowed out from within. The climate shifted, the river failed, the people starved, and the civilization that had built the greatest monuments in the history of the world, monuments that still stand today, 4,000 years later, still stunning in their precision and their scale, That civilization disintegrated within a generation, not because of a foreign invasion, not because of a great plague, but because the system that held it together had grown too old, too rigid, too dependent on a single center of gravity. And when that center finally gave way, when the old king finally died, there was nothing left to hold the pieces together. Let that sink in. The Old Kingdom of Egypt lasted approximately 8 centuries. That is longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the British Empire, longer than the distance between the signing of the Magna Carta and the present day. 8 centuries of continuous civilization, of monumental construction, of divine kingship, of a bureaucracy so sophisticated that it could organize the labor of a nation for a single building project. And it ended. It ended not because it was attacked, but because it could not change. It ended because the very stability that made it great became the rigidity that made it fragile. And Egypt was not alone. We have seen it now again and again. The Akkadian Empire, the Indus Valley Civilization, the ancestral Puebloans, the Khmer Empire, Cahokia, each one reached heights that seemed permanent. Each one collapsed when the environment shifted and the institutions could not adapt. The details change, the geography changes, the century changes, but the underlying dynamic is always the same. Human beings build complex systems to manage their environment, and those systems work beautifully, until the environment changes faster than the system can respond. This is not science fiction. This is the historical record. This is what the archaeological evidence, accumulated over 2 centuries of excavation and analysis, has revealed about the nature of civilizational survival. And the lesson it teaches is not that civilizations always collapse, because many adapt, many survive, many transform themselves in the face of crisis. Egypt itself eventually recovered. The Middle Kingdom that followed the First Intermediate Period was in many ways more sophisticated, more adaptable, and more humane than the Old Kingdom that preceded it. The lesson is subtler and more troubling. The civilizations that collapse are not the weak ones. They are the ones that become too successful to imagine their own failure. Consider the numbers. Over the course of recorded human history, roughly the last 5,000 years, there have been hundreds of civilizations, kingdoms, empires, and organized societies across every inhabited continent. Of these, the vast majority no longer exist. The Sumerian city-states, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms, the Maurya Empire of India, the Han Dynasty of China, the Roman Empire, the Maya city-states, the Aztec Triple Alliance, the Kingdom of Benin, the Mongol Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Most of these left successors, inheritors, cultural descendants, but the specific political and social systems that define them, the institutions, the bureaucracies, the belief systems, the networks of trade and obligation, those are gone, vanished without explanation in some cases, gradually absorbed in others, but gone. The American archaeologist Joseph Tainter, in his landmark study of civilizational collapse, argued that complex societies are inherently vulnerable to what he called diminishing marginal returns on investment in complexity. In plain language, this means that the more complex a society becomes, the more resources it must invest simply to maintain its existing level of complexity, and at some point, the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the benefit it provides. When that happens, simplification becomes not a disaster, but an adaptive strategy. People abandon the cities, not because they are stupid, but because the cities are no longer worth the cost. They move to simpler, smaller, more resilient forms of organization, villages, kinship networks, pastoral nomadism, that require less investment and provide more immediate return. Tainter's theory is elegant, and it fits the evidence from many collapses, including the fall of the Old Kingdom. By the end of Pepi's reign, the cost of maintaining the centralized state, the pyramid construction, the temple maintenance, the bureaucratic apparatus, the foreign expeditions, the military garrisons, had grown to the point where the provinces were receiving less in return than they were giving. The provincial governors, who stopped sending tribute to Memphis, were not acting irrationally. They were making an economic calculation. The center was no longer providing sufficient benefits to justify the cost of loyalty. And when the drought hit, that calculation became even starker. Why send grain to a distant capital when your own people are starving? But Tainter's theory, while powerful, misses something important, something that the story of Pepi II illuminates with particular clarity. It misses the human dimension. The collapse of the Old Kingdom was not just an economic adjustment, it was a spiritual catastrophe. The Egyptians did not simply lose a government, they lost a cosmology. They lost the belief that the universe was ordered, that the king was divine, that Mat, cosmic justice, governed the world. The literature of the First Intermediate Period is haunted by this loss in a way that no economic model can capture. When the author of the Dialogue of a Man with His Soul describes a world where no one can be trusted and death is the only relief, he is not describing a rational adjustment to diminishing returns. He is describing despair. He is describing the psychological aftermath of watching everything you believed in, every certainty, every institution, every promise of permanence, dissolve like sand in water. And this is the deeper truth that the story of Pepi II reveals. Civilizations do not just collapse materially, they collapse psychologically. The physical destruction, the abandoned cities, the empty temples, the unplowed fields, is devastating. But the psychological destruction is worse, because when a civilization collapses, it does not just destroy buildings, it destroys meaning. It destroys the shared understanding of how the world works, of who we are, of what our lives are for. And rebuilding meaning, rebuilding the shared narrative that allows people to cooperate, to trust, to sacrifice for the common good, is far harder than rebuilding walls. Think about what Ma'at meant to the Egyptians. It was not simply a concept of justice or truth, though it included both. Ma'at was the principle that the universe itself was ordered, that there was a right way for things to be, a correct relationship between human beings and the gods, between the king and his people, between the living and the dead. The pharaoh's primary duty was to maintain Ma'at, to ensure that the cosmic order persisted. When the Nile flooded on schedule, that was Ma'at. When justice was administered fairly, that was Ma'at. When the dead were buried with proper rites, that was Ma'at. The entire structure of the Old Kingdom, its temples, its pyramids, its priesthoods, its bureaucracy, was, in a very real sense, a machine for producing and maintaining Ma'at. And when the Old Kingdom collapsed, Ma'at collapsed with it. The Nile did not flood. Justice was not administered. The dead were thrown into the river because no one could afford to bury them. The machine had broken down, and the people who had trusted the machine, who had organized their entire understanding of reality around its functioning, were left in a world that no longer made sense. Every civilization has its own version of Ma'at, its own foundational narrative about how the world works and why the system deserves loyalty. For Rome, it was the eternal city, the Pax Romana, the conviction that Roman law represented the final achievement of political wisdom. For the medieval Christian world, it was the great chain of being, the belief that every person, from the Pope to the peasant, occupied a divinely ordained place in the cosmic hierarchy. For the modern West, it is progress, the assumption that the future will be better than the past, that technology will solve the problems that technology creates, that growth is natural and decline is aberrant. Each of these narratives serves the same function that Ma'at served for the Egyptians. It provides meaning, it justifies sacrifice, it makes the complexity of civilizational life feel purposeful rather than arbitrary. And each of these narratives is vulnerable to the same catastrophe that destroyed Ma'at, the catastrophe of events that refuse to conform to the story. The Egyptian poet who wrote, 4,000 years ago, that he wished for death because the world had become unbearable. That poet was not speaking only for his own time. He was speaking for every generation that has watched its certainties crumble. For the citizens of Rome watching the legions withdraw from Britain. For the Maya priest watching the last ceremony performed in a temple that would never be used again. For the Khmer engineer watching the canals silt up and knowing that the knowledge to repair them was dying with his generation. For every human being who has stood at the edge of a ruin and understood, with a clarity that no textbook can convey, that permanence is an illusion. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from standing in a ruin. Not the sharp grief of a sudden loss, but the slow, heavy grief of understanding that an entire way of life, an entire way of understanding the world, has been extinguished. The archaeologist knows this grief intimately. Every excavation is an act of mourning as much as an act of discovery. When an archaeologist uncovers the skeleton of a child buried 4,000 years ago, clutching a small clay toy, the scientific questions: how old was the child? What caused the death? What does the burial practice tell us about the culture? Exist alongside a simpler, more human response: sadness. Sadness for the child. Sadness for the parents who buried their child with a toy, hoping it would accompany them into whatever came next. Sadness for a world that loved its children as much as we love ours, and that could not protect them from the forces that were tearing it apart. Return now to Pepi II. Return to the boy who wrote that letter, the letter about the dancing dwarf, the letter full of excitement and urgency and joy. That boy lived to be an old man. He lived longer than almost anyone in the ancient world. He sat on the throne of the most powerful civilization on Earth for the better part of a century, and at the end of his life, everything he had governed was failing. The Nile floods were weakening. The provincial governors were ignoring Memphis. The granaries were running low. The rituals continued. The priests still chanted, the offerings were still made, the festivals were still observed. But the rituals had lost their power because the system they were supposed to sustain was already dying. We do not know what Pepi thought in those final years. We have no personal writings from his old age, no diary, no confession. The inscriptions from the end of his reign are formulaic, the same boilerplate claims of divine power and eternal glory that every pharaoh commissioned. But behind the formulas, we can imagine a man who had outlived everyone he had ever known. His mother, who had governed Egypt in his name, was long dead. His uncle Zhao, who had served as vizier, was long dead. The explorer Harkhuf, who had brought the dancing dwarf from Nubia, was long dead. The officials who had served him in his youth, and their children, and their grandchildren, all dead. By the end of a 94-year reign, Pepi II would have been the only person alive who remembered what Egypt had been at the beginning of his rule. He was, in a sense, the last witness to his own civilization's health, and he was helpless to restore it. Consider what that means for a moment. Every person who had known how the system worked at its peak, every administrator who had managed the grain redistributions efficiently, every engineer who had maintained the irrigation channels, every diplomat who had sustained the trade networks, those people were gone. Their replacements had learned their craft in an era of decline, had inherited responsibilities without the institutional knowledge needed to fulfill them, had been trained by predecessors who were themselves working with diminished resources and diminished authority. The system was not just aging, it was losing its memory. The know-how that had built the pyramids, that had organized the labor of a nation, that had maintained the most sophisticated bureaucracy in the ancient world, that knowledge was quietly draining away, generation by generation, like water seeping from a cracked vessel. And no one alive could see it happening, because no one alive remembered the vessel when it was full. There is something profoundly sad about that image. A very old man, surrounded by the trappings of absolute power, in a palace that still functioned with all the ceremony of centuries, presiding over a kingdom that was quietly, irreversibly dying. The god-king who could not make it rain, the divine ruler who could not feed his people, the boy who had once been so excited about a dancing dwarf that he could barely contain himself, now sitting in silence at the end of the longest reign in history, watching the world he had been given slip away. And here is the thought that arrives at 3 a.m. and will not leave. We live inside a civilization. We live inside a system of extraordinary complexity. A system that provides us with food, water, energy, communication, transportation, medicine, and knowledge on a scale that no previous civilization has ever achieved. We take this system for granted, the way the Egyptians took the Nile flood for granted. We assume it will continue, because it has always continued within our living memory. But the archaeological record suggests that this assumption is the most dangerous assumption a civilization can make, because every civilization that collapsed believed, right up until the moment of collapse, that it was permanent, that its systems were too sophisticated to fail, that its knowledge was too advanced to be lost, that its gods, or its technologies, or its institutions, would protect it from the fate that had befallen lesser peoples. The Old Kingdom of Egypt lasted 8 centuries and produced the Great Pyramids. The Khmer Empire lasted 6 centuries and produced Angkor Wat. The Roman Empire lasted, depending on how you count, between 5 and 15 centuries and produced the most extensive legal and engineering legacy in Western history. All of them fell. All of them were eventually reduced to ruins that later generations would visit with wonder and incomprehension. And the question that the story of Pepi II forces us to confront, the question that sits at the bottom of every archaeological trench, inscribed on every weathered stone, is whether we are different, whether the civilization we live inside is exempt from the pattern, whether we are the exception to a rule that has held for 5,000 years of recorded human experience. The honest answer, the answer that any responsible archaeologist would give, is that we do not know. We do not know if we are different. We know that we have technologies that no previous civilization possessed. We know that our scientific understanding of the world is more accurate and more extensive than any that has come before. We know that our global communication networks, our medical knowledge, our agricultural productivity are without historical precedent. But we also know that the Egyptians believed their civilization was eternal. We know that the Romans believed their empire was the final form of human government. We know that the Khmer believed Angkor would last forever. Every civilization believes it is the exception. And so far, none of them have been right. What we do know, what the story of Pepi II teaches with a clarity that no modern policy paper can match, is that the warning signs are always the same. The concentration of power in aging institutions that resist reform, the growing distance between rulers and the ruled, the slow depletion of the environmental resources that sustain the system, the substitution of ritual for reality, the continued performance of ceremonies that once had meaning but have become empty gestures, maintained out of habit rather than conviction. And above all, the dangerous, seductive belief that because the system has always worked, it will always work, that because the Nile has always flooded, it will always flood, that because the lights have always come on when we flip the switch, they will always come on. The Egyptians had a word for the opposite of Mat. The word was Isfet, chaos, disorder, the dissolution of everything that held the world together. For 8 centuries, the Old Kingdom kept Isfet at bay. Its pyramids were monuments to the triumph of order over chaos, permanence over impermanence, the divine over the mortal, and then Isfet won, not through conquest, not through revolution, but through the quiet, patient accumulation of small failures that no one noticed until it was too late. 4,000 years later, the pyramids still stand. The Nile still flows, though it is now tamed by the Aswan High Dam, and in the dusty storerooms of museums around the world, fragments of papyrus preserve the voices of people who lived through the collapse, people who tried to make sense of a world that had lost its meaning. Their words reach us across the millennia, still raw, still urgent, still bearing the weight of a grief that time has not diminished. They speak to us because they are us, because the fear of collapse, the fear that everything we have built might one day simply stop working, is not an ancient fear. It is the most modern fear there is. So what do we do with this knowledge? That is the question that every person who has followed this story to its end will eventually ask. Because the story of Pepi II is not finally a story about despair. It is a story about awareness. And awareness, while uncomfortable, is the precondition for survival. The civilizations that collapsed, every one of them, shared a common trait. They were blind to their own fragility. The Old Kingdom could not see that its tax exemptions were hollowing out the treasury. The Akkadian Empire could not see that its dependence on rain-fed agriculture left it vulnerable to drought. The Khmer could not see that their hydraulic system had reached the limits of its capacity. The ancestral Puebloans could not see that their redistribution networks would fail when surplus vanished. In every case, the collapse was preceded by a period of apparent prosperity, a period when the monuments were still being built, the ceremonies still being performed, the formulas still being recited. The surface looked fine, the depths were crumbling. But here is the crucial difference between those civilizations and ours. And it is the only difference that matters. We have the archaeological record. We have the accumulated knowledge of 2 centuries of excavation, analysis, and comparative study. We know what happened to them. We know the patterns. We know the warning signs. And we know, because Pepi II's story tells us so, because Angkor tells us so, because Chaco Canyon and Cahokia and the Akkadian Empire and the Indus Valley all tell us so, that the most dangerous moment for any civilization is the moment when it stops believing that collapse is possible. Egypt, after all, did not die, it recovered. The Middle Kingdom that emerged from the chaos of the First Intermediate Period was in many ways a more just, more flexible, more human civilization than the one that had come before. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom learned the lessons of the Old Kingdom's failure. They reformed the provincial administration, reasserting central control while granting the nomarchs enough autonomy to maintain local governance. They invested in irrigation infrastructure, not the grand monumental projects of the pyramid builders, but practical, functional systems designed to protect against the variability of the Nile that had proven so devastating. They created literature that grappled with suffering and uncertainty, rather than pretending that the cosmic order was invulnerable. The wisdom literature of the Middle Kingdom, texts like the Instruction of Amenemhat and the Tale of Sinuhe, reflects a society that had been humbled by catastrophe and had emerged with a deeper, more nuanced understanding of power, loyalty, and the fragility of human achievement. The dialogue of a man with his soul, that text of devastating despair, was not the last word. It was the beginning of a new conversation about what it means to live in a world where permanence is not guaranteed. The Middle Kingdom also addressed the specific institutional weakness that had doomed Pepi's kingdom: the hereditary concentration of power in the provinces. The pharaoh Senusret III, one of the most capable rulers of the Middle Kingdom, systematically reduced the power of the nomarchs, reorganizing Egypt's administration to prevent the kind of centrifugal drift that had hollowed out the Old Kingdom. He did not abolish local governance. He restructured it, creating a system of administrative districts overseen by officials who reported directly to the crown, breaking the dynastic chains of provincial power that had strangled Pepi's kingdom from within. It was, in essence, a civilizational course correction, proof that collapse, while devastating, need not be final. That is the gift hidden inside the grief. The knowledge that civilizations can fail is also the knowledge that they can learn, that they can adapt, that the rigidity that killed the Old Kingdom can be replaced by something more supple, more resilient, more honest about the world as it actually is, rather than the world as we wish it to be. The story of Pepi II is a warning, but it is also, if we read it rightly, an instruction manual, not for how to prevent collapse, because some collapses may be inevitable, but for how to build systems that can bend without breaking, how to maintain institutions that serve the people rather than merely perpetuating themselves, how to listen to the environment rather than assuming it will always provide, how to remember that the Nile does not flood because we are worthy of it. It floods because of monsoons in Ethiopia, and monsoons can change. It is late now. The desert outside Saqqara is dark. The stars above the Nile Valley are the same stars that Pepi II saw when he was a boy, when he sat on the throne of the Two Lands and wrote a letter about a dancing dwarf, when the world was young and he was young, and the kingdom seemed as permanent as the stone from which its monuments were carved. The pyramid of Pepi II still stands at South Saqqara. It is not impressive by the standards of Ziza. It is smaller, more weathered, its limestone casing long since stripped away by centuries of quarrying, but it stands. Inside its chambers, the pyramid texts still line the walls. Spells for the resurrection of a king who believed he would ascend to the stars and live forever among the gods. He did not ascend to the stars. He died, an old man in a failing kingdom, and the world he had governed for nearly a century died with him, but his words survived. The letter about the dancing dwarf survived. The pyramid texts survived. The grief of the poets who came after him survived. And because those words survived, because some scribe, some priest, some anonymous Egyptian who understood that words carved in stone outlast the kingdoms that carve them, we know the story. We know what happened. We know how it ended. And we know, if we are willing to listen, how it might have been different. That is worth something. That may be worth everything, because the difference between a civilization that collapses in ignorance and a civilization that confronts its vulnerabilities with open eyes is the difference between tragedy and transformation. Pepi II could not have saved the Old Kingdom. The forces arrayed against it, the climate, the institutional decay, the sheer passage of time, were beyond any single ruler's control. But we are not a single ruler. We are billions of people, connected by technologies that the boy king could not have imagined, equipped with knowledge that his wisest advisors never possessed. We have the one thing that Pepi did not have, the ability to see the pattern. And seeing the pattern is the first step, the essential, irreplaceable first step toward breaking it. If this story moved you, or made you think, or kept you awake a little longer than you intended, share it, not for us, for the pattern. Because the more people who understand how civilizations fail, the better our chances of building one that does not. The knowledge is there, carved in stone and buried in sand, waiting for anyone willing to listen to the silence that follows the collapse. Thank you for watching. And remember the dancing dwarf. Remember the boy on the throne, 8 or 9 years old, so excited he could barely get the words out. Remember that even the longest reign in history was not long enough to hold back the tide. But remember too that Egypt survived, that human beings have stared into the abyss of civilizational collapse again and again across the millennia, and again they have found a way to rebuild. Not the same civilization, not the same structures, but something, always something. The ruins are not the end of the story. They are the proof that there was a story worth telling. And the telling itself, the act of remembering, of understanding, of passing the knowledge forward, is how we keep the story going.